Well, hello and welcome. You are now listening to and perhaps watching the Spark Your Creative podcast. And I am your host, Sharon Burton of Spark Your Creative Coaching. And I offer this as a way to support artists and creatives at midlife and beyond um, for a variety of different topics, whether it's creative blocks or getting through the pandemic. So today is the second of a series, another new series I'm doing, which is really looking at the well-being and self-care of artists and creatives, filling the well. And I am really excited about this particular series, as I was with the one of working through the pandemic, because it's related. And today's topic is rather serious, but important to talk about because there's so much that we have had to grieve in the last 2 years. We've had to grieve everything from death of family members and friends from COVID or other illnesses that COVID kind of, the stress of COVID, I think, brought on for some people. We've had to grieve our former lives, our former spaces, our former way of doing things. We've had to deal with breakups, divorce, maybe even some family issues, just a variety of things that the pandemic has brought to all of us. But particularly as artists, it's really important because really recognizing that there is a grieving process that many of us are going through and how that may affect us as far as our creative practice is important to acknowledge. And I think just about everyone has had to deal with some form of grief. And so I am delighted to bring a creative grief educator and fellow artist for this particular podcast. And her name is Cara Elsie Jones. And as I said, she's a creative grief educator and her heARTist, which is like artist, behind grief and creativity. She co-founded both the Creative Grief Studio and KotaPress. She's a Carnegie Mellon graduate who interned 3 years at Mr. Rogers' neighborhood back in the day. And she has spent the last couple of decades exploring creative approaches to the grief experience. And so I just want to thank you and welcome you to the podcast, Cara.
Yeah, thank you so much for making these spaces, Sharon. I think these conversations are so important and can help so many people in like a lot of different levels, personal grief, collective grief, our art making, the way we shape our practice if we're doing support work. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here today.
And I'm happy to have you. So, what I thought we would do is start off with talking a little bit about what you do, because I think it's a very unique and much needed thing. And I imagine you're probably pretty busy these days. So, share with us a little bit about your work and how you got started with this. And I think it's awesome that you worked with Mr. Rogers back in the day. I'm like, wow, that would have been really cool to work with him and learn a lot from him and his approach.
Yeah, that work was really formative in that I was doing a lot of child development research and work around the language, Fred's language, how he spoke with children and families. What I found, how it ended up translating in my life was that I ended up feeling we never stopped that development. It doesn't stop just because we reach 18 or 21 or, it really becomes a human development. And especially because we're mortal and we're all going to experience grief and loss at some point, those developmental experiences and skills, the urgency around them comes up when people have grief experiences. The thing that set me, I was already a writer and an artist, and but our son died in 1999, and his death really shattered everything. Identity, work, priority, family, faith, And so I spent several years, of course, seeking support first. As a family, we did a lot of seeking, and then it translated into going beyond my own personal experience into facilitating spaces for other folks who were having their own grief experiences. And as I was doing that facilitation work, I started talking to other facilitators, and I was always having conversations about places that, as helpers, helping professionals, they felt stuck. They felt their group was stuck. They felt the conversations were stuck. And so, the creative things that I had been doing personally, just because that's how I am, it started to creep into these other conversations. And so, early 2000s, I started doing personal grief support. So directly to a person who's grieving or family who's grieving, holding those kinds of spaces. And then in 2011, I think it was, I worked doing coaching one-on-one with a woman named Kath Duncan. And she had a similar experience where things had, really shifted in her life from a grief experience. And we did about maybe 6 months of work together. And then she kind of went away. She was going to think about what now, right? As we had done our work together, what was next. She came back to me and she said, I have this idea. She said, would you write an article or maybe like do a recording, a talk or something? And the more she talked about this, the initial idea was for continuing education for coaches. I said to her, let's throw our hats in the ring. We had never met. We had worked entirely online. She was in Canada. I was in the United States. I said, let's throw our hats in the ring and do this. And she went, all right, let's do it. So in 2012, she and I launched this online continuing education program for helping professionals. We thought coaches at first. She and I are both deal with disabilities in different ways. So it was important for us to have it be online, and accessibility was a high priority for us in the way we created it. And then we really quickly got coaches and therapists and counselors and musicians and bakers, and
wow,
the range of people that we got who wanted this information to take back to whatever niche they were in we were just floored. And so we've continued to do that work. And of course, then when the pandemic came, it was, wow, knock every piece of wood you can find, because we had already been, I didn't have to recreate anything in 2020. We were in the middle of a session and we just ran with it. So, that's my son's death initially got me into it. We had other experiences with stillbirth. And then I've had different experiences with chronic illness and disability. These things keep me curious about my own experience. And then as I'm working with helping peers, people who are holding these kinds of spaces for other people, I continue to stay curious. I continue to understand that I can know my own experiences, but even at that, the experience with my son's death in 99 was completely different than the experience with another son's death in 2010. Mm-hmm. And I went, oh, this is so interesting. Even in my own body, I didn't know how different this grief experience was going to be.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And so I realized, so when I'm sitting with someone, I can know my own stuff, but it's important for me to hold the space of when someone says, I'm grieving or I have to heal, for me to say to them, tell me more about that. where did what does healing feel like and sound like and smell like? What texture does it have? Where did you first encounter it? When it comes up in your head, is it in your own voice? Is it somebody else's? Like, who first recruited you into this idea of healing? Those kinds of generative questions that come out of a space of like holding a space of, I don't know what's happening for this person, even if their circumstances of loss were similar. I possibly don't know what they mean by grief or mourning or healing or closure, and so that was kind of, that seemed to, as I was working initially with other facilitators, and then what Kath and I turned into this creative continuing education program, that seemed to be like a kind of launching pad for people, where people would get curious again and get new answers out of their groups, and find new spaces when they let go of the assumption that we know what a grief support group is.
Right. Because it can show up differently, and people's experience with, the grief support group, which is based on, the psychology or social work model,
Right.
which is different than what you're working from a creative artist point of view, and using, creativity to kind of help move people forward, has to be, maybe close to art therapy, probably more than anything else.
Yeah.
I think it's very unique. And I saw that you have this, continuing education program, which I think is great, that you offer so many different people, whether they're coaches or folks that are actually artists and creatives, because of what they work, especially if they work with other creatives. One of the things that I wanted to, just as a sort of a baseline for our discussion, what is your definition of grief? And we kind of talked about that, but just so that people can kind of understand, who might be listening, your perspective of what grief is.
Yeah, so again, that's the kind of a space I try to hold open to let people tell me how they are defining grief. But, trying to be open to grief can come from a death circumstance or a non-death circumstance. It doesn't have to be related to death. And it can come in big ways, it can come in small ways. And trying to really hold a space for people that whatever the worst grief experiences that they have had, that's the worst experience they've had. Okay. And that was a hard space of defining how to hold grief for me, because, if you had come to me a week after my son died and said, "Oh, I understand what you're going through because my dog died," I would not have been able to hold that. Right. But in the years since then, where I've encountered families where like a service animal has died, that's a member of the family dying. And that, so holding that space of whatever is the worst, whatever you're bringing to the table, that's the grief, and you're allowed to define it. You're allowed to call it grief. Okay. That's cool. Because I know, I think, and I'm just speaking for myself, I know traditionally when I would hear that word, I would always think of death. The death of somebody. And it's only since I've, become more mature, that I've learned that grief comes in different ways, and maybe, like you said, maybe somebody didn't die, but, you might have severed a relationship, or there might have been, just, even just dealing with, like I said, with the pandemic, being used to, moving about the world differently, and now it's, depending on where you are and how you view things, you have to wear masks and the 6 feet distance thing, and, washing your hands, and being cognizant of whether or not somebody has, a vaccine or non-vaccinated or whatever. Yeah.
but just the fact that things are, for example, I was talking to a friend about going to visit um, a girlfriend of mine in out of town, and I haven't traveled
Yeah.
um, by plane, by public transportation. Well, I did take the train, but I haven't taken the plane.
Yeah.
And it's I was like, what am I
It's
supposed to get a COVID test, and how did and just navigating that in my head, like you really have to plan if you're going to
yes.
do something. It's not something that you can just whip and do.
Mhm.
um and this is something that's a couple months from now, so it can be done, but it was just sort of the realization that being able to just jump on a plane and go somewhere, you know um there's a part of me that grieves that. you
Yes.
know
Yes.
um One of the things that well, let me ask you this. What would you say is the benefit of using creativity, and how do you use creativity with people as far as dealing with grief?
Yeah. So it's interesting. The same way that I was speaking about kind of breaking open the definition of grief, or holding an open space for how we define grief or approach grief. It's the same with creativity, because I do get a lot of people who will say, "Oh, I don't paint.
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
I'm not creative. I
Yeah.
don't paint." And so it's a fascinating conversation to help people navigate. Well, what does creativity mean?
Mhm.
Can creativity be a conversation? Can
Mhm.
creativity be generative questions, music, movement, texture? What can it be? And it also, because I think people have some art therapy is kind of out there, and kind of well known, and so they'll have some questions about, well, isn't it making visual art, and or working with clay or something. It can be, yes, of course it can be, but part of the very sort of conscious space I went into using the word creativity and approaching grief experiences creatively using that kind of language, was just because I found that the creativity came in so many different ways for people.
Mhm. Mhm.
I've worked with people who, they were artists before the loss experience. And after the loss experience, they say, I haven't been able to write a word. I think I'm
Right.
not a writer anymore.
Right.
And so expanding the definition of creativity for them, or someone who says, I can't manage my, job that was the regular paycheck. All I want to do is knit.
Yeah.
I just obsessively want to knit. And so navigating this, well, so what does this creativity mean? And how does it dance in our lives? And what does it sound like and move like? And um, I think that in some ways we can't help but be creative when grief experiences happen. I haven't really met anyone who's had, big grief or small grief, however you want to sort of,
Define that. Yeah.
define that. But I haven't met anyone with whatever their experience is, um, hasn't uh, um, had to re-examine something, had to
Right.
pause for a bit and go, what is happening?
Right. Right.
Um, Even if it's just, I've had a lot of people who say, I didn't realize this whole grief world was out here running. Like, I came into this and thought nothing existed. And now you're telling me there's 16 foundations for this. And, there's artists who do that. And I didn't know you all were out here. I didn't know this world existed.
And that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because I think we think of therapy,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
and therapy may or may not work for people. Sometimes there's some people that the therapy, or the traditional therapy model psychology is not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
And I think particularly for highly sensitive people,
Mhm.
which artists tend to be,
Mhm.
we may need a different kind of intervention. Some of us can do the therapy thing, but sometimes we need more than that. I was just talking to a therapist earlier today, and I said, I think really people, especially now, need more than just a therapist,
Yeah.
and yoga. I
Yeah.
think you
Yeah.
need a therapist. I think you need a life coach type person. I think you need someone like you that, or like me, that, that kind of coach people creatively through their
Mhm.
blocks and kind of move them forward using things that and helping them kind of reclaim what they like and what they feel
Yeah.
comfortable doing from a creative sense, and
Mhm.
leaning on that creative practice as a way of self-care.
Yeah.
And I think I don't I I don't know about you, but when I talk to a lot of clients and people, I don't think a lot of them really, some do, but a lot of them don't think of it as self-care. You know what I'm saying? They
Mhm.
don't think of it from that lens.
Yeah.
And I try to say, and particularly when people are a little bit blocked, look at it as, I'm just doing this for self-care,
Mhm.
time for myself, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're nodding, because I was like, sometimes I'm like, well, am I out there with that? Because I know it helps me,
Yeah.
with my
Mhm.
self-care. A lot of times I am creating work for shows or whatever, but it's a very meditative experience for me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think it's one of those natural meditations, that I
Mhm.
grew up with,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it was interesting to think back to my childhood. Recently, I had to write. I'm writing a book, actually.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
that's
good.
that's going to be inspiration for midlife creators.
Okay.
And I was, sort of sharing my story, and I was like, wow, and just really thinking about how I think my creativity helped me through some difficult times, but I
Mm.
didn't think of it at the time. When you're a kid,
Yes.
you're
Yeah.
thinking about that. But when I think back on it, I think it was sort of a way to kind of deal with things that were confusing or hurtful,
Yeah.
in my
Yeah.
life.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
let me,
I think what's interesting, Sharon, is that it, there's so much emphasis in our culture about grief being an individual's experience. And
mm-hmm,
yet there's a bigger reality in that our grief experiences are very much shaped by the sociocultural, institutional, social contracts, And so
absolutely.
sometimes when I'm encountering people and having these conversations, it's the first time they've had a space to question something like closure
Mm,
and to question something like stages or tasks or some of these different modern Western medical
paradigms that we're
racialized
growing.
capitalist
Yeah, this
paradigms.
whole paradigm, and we're at a point of society with everything that has happened, and the
Mhm.
pandemic, in my opinion, brought us to the point where we had to sit down and
Yes.
see what's going on, because we were rolling, we were
Yep.
running, we
Yep.
weren't paying attention. And you're right, I think questioning how some of these age-old constructs, have they really served us, and
Mhm.
have they served us, and from what I can see, I don't know,
Yeah.
you know
For me, it's been what I first started sitting with in 2020 that really sat me down for a lot of months was this realization that when our son died in 99,
Mhm.
there was a generation of both of our families that was still alive that were World War II survivors. And their experience of grief and loss had been so much unprocessed trauma, both individually and collectively. And when things were said and done, they came back home, the factories opened, you went back to work, you got back to
Yeah,
having children,
yeah.
you just
You
got
just
back
kept
at it.
moving. You just kept moving,
Exactly.
and you didn't think about how traumatic these guys coming back, even the fact that women were working, and then now you're snatching them out of the factory. They got used to making money and
Yes.
providing for their families. And I'm thinking World War II right now, but
Yes.
and then, all right, you need to go back home. And there's a lot there.
There's a lot. And I'm seeing it in my grandchildren's generation now, with them being pushed, be productive again, go back to school. Everything has to open again. You've got to have bodies in the school. And I literally, I sat for months in 2020, Sharon, going, what is happening?
What is going on here? Okay.
Yeah. But I think we're in a better place to have the conversations about individual and collective.
I think so.
And to question the social contracts. And at least I hope.
I think so. I think there's, I think just like with anything else, there's forces that want to keep it that way because it's comfortable, it works for them, even though it really isn't working for them, but they think it works for them. Mm-hmm. But there's enough in the collective that's questioning it. It's questioning everything. Yeah. And sometimes that questioning can scare some people. Yeah. But anyway, but what we were talking about, as artists and creatives, what is some tips that you have that may be experiencing some kind of grief, whether they got a divorce, a lot of that's been going on.
Yes,
or they might grieve their former life. They might grieve the fact that they're more isolated, or they may grieve, family members. I have quite a few friends, which is really interesting in the last 2 years, who have lost parents, and not necessarily to COVID, but to other things.
Adjacent to.
And I don't know about you, I just think the energy of COVID and the stress of it, even if you have something else, has contributed to these folks. Yes. Or in some cases, I think some folks that might have still be here decided they were just going to check out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, as a disabled and chronically ill person myself, there have been lots of times where I've had to put off care.
Yeah.
And you have to put off the test, and you have to put off the elective surgeries. Aren't just like plastic surgery to get rid of wrinkles. Elective surgeries are a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And I definitely think that has contributed, and like a lot of adjacent losses. It might not be COVID on the death certificate, but
it's adjacent, and it may not be COVID, but I just think the energy, that's the heaviness. Yeah. And if you're terminally ill, whereas maybe you might fight it and last a couple more years, I just feel like people are just like, this is crazy right now. I'm just rolling out, and that's just me. I have no idea. I have not talked to any of these people, but how, if I'm a creative, I'm an artist, and what are some tips starting with acknowledging that the feeling I have is grieving and then moving forward?
Yeah.
You say?
The thing that's interesting for like a starting point is even just naming it grief. You said that earlier. A lot of times people don't really even recognize consciously that what's happening could be called grief.
Yeah.
So even just that kind of starting point of, oh, okay, maybe I am dealing with grief. Maybe there's a grief process happening here. And then kind of like the key starting point for a lot of people that I work with, and even educators, other helping professionals, is to really look at, we call it at the studio, the big book of grief rules. So to really kind of look at what are the grief rules that have come with this experience. Sometimes they're internalized. Sometimes they've been, kind of put on us from external things. Sometimes if you listen to it, it's somebody else's voice saying, 3 days paid bereavement leave must mean in 3 days you should be over it. Like we've internalized something about a social contract without questioning, why did I come to that conclusion?
Right.
About the capitalist grind rule that
has to be 3 days, and then we're back.
Get back at it, back to normal, and so or if people struggle with, if the word closure comes up, because that does come up a lot for people, I have to find closure. What is the rule? What are the rules and the values that are underpinning these things? Because what happens is then people aren't just having the grief experience, they're having shame on top of grief because they're not doing it right, or haven't been able to figure it out, or why can't I get closure yet? And so there's shame on top of it. There's like a feeling of being oppressed from your agency, like how many choices you have in things. And so I encourage people to start thinking about, like, well, what is this grief experience? Like, what is happening for you? How is it that you feel you can only grieve like in a way that nobody else can see it? Who recruited you into that idea? Like, where did that start to be a thing in your head? And so a lot of times what people find when we explore something like the Big Book of Grief Rules is that it's not just the two of us sitting in this space talking. There's a lot of people and there's a lot of cultural, institutional stuff
that's with that group.
With that, that's happening.
Yeah.
And so sometimes just that beginning kind of conversation is enough to sort of open up, like, oh, okay, there's more space here than I thought there was.
Right.
And what can I do with, how can I move through it in this different way now that I've found some more space for it? And I, especially with the pandemic, as a chronically ill person myself, there was a lot of isolation and different sort of way of living prior to the pandemic for me anyway. So it wasn't a completely huge shift. I've been having coffee dates on Skype and Zoom for a decade, so it wasn't a huge shift for me. But for someone who's not encountered that pandemic space feels smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, more oppressive and restrictive. And so, okay.
Yeah.
What is out there for us creatively? I've seen the most creative things, Sharon. There's a woman who hosts, I think it's every Friday, like an hour and a half or 2 hours. She has her camera on like this, and she'll do a little introduction, but all she's doing is sitting in her studio space writing. She's working on her book, and everyone comes in and they all write together for an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Purely came out of the pandemic because she was used to going to a cafe with just other people around. And that kind of alternative sort of filled that need. And that's kind of maybe that's part of the beginning conversation too, is you're in a space now where your needs are not being met in the same way. And that happens with grief a lot, right? Yeah. Grief happens, and the relationships you had pre-loss don't fill the different and new kinds of needs you have. And sometimes what happens is we try to shoehorn our pre-existing relationships into, and those folks or that connection, it fills whatever needs it fills, but it can't do this.
And that's interesting that you brought that up, because I think for me, I haven't had to deal with physical death during this whole pandemic. My parents are deceased and have been for quite some time, so they missed all this, and thank God they're on the other side helping me get through this, right? But I experienced more of what you just said, relationships, friendships that I thought, like so-and-so is my girl, and and then it's like there's like relationships with me and a few people just changed overnight. And I even severed some relationships and didn't really, and I struggled with that, and some of them were fellow creatives that I really, worked with. And it's funny because then there's some people that I hadn't dealt with for a while before COVID are kind of coming back. So it's like this weird, like, okay, switch, and then everybody, and it's like, okay, but still there's some relationships, friendships that I grieve. And and even some personal relationships that switched. That I found myself grieving and had a terrible time. I've since kind of adjusted. But it did affect me for a while, because some of it was there was no explanation. you know,
Yes.
it was just, I don't know. And I think there's something to be said about that. And I'm glad you mentioned, that there's, you know,
Yeah.
that's part of it too. And that we go through the grieving process of those people
Yeah.
that were once a very important part of our lives.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I've learned to embrace the new people because a lot of them are more equipped
Yes.
to help me, and I'm more equipped to help them.
Yeah.
It's a whole different energy,
Yeah.
which I think is very important.
Yeah.
Um,
Pauline Boss spent most of her career talking about what she calls ambiguous loss. And that's, a loss where the person is no longer part of your life, but they're not dead, or, they're not emotionally available, even if they are physically still in your life. And so, that
Yeah.
sort of, they haven't died, but the emotional availability is just not
It's
there
not there.
anymore.
Yeah.
And so trying to help people identify, like, so what needs do you have now that are unmet, and how can we meet them in a different way? Maybe that person, you can still have some other type of relationship with them, or maybe not. Maybe it's just gotten to the point where it's no.
Well, and that's interesting too, because in some cases you find that, you talk about the emotional availability piece, if they're just not trying to do that, and, you're still where you thought you were with that person, and sometimes it's just that loss of redefining that and letting that situation go, because, and some of it may be just temporary, until things sort of rights itself, that it's not going to quite be anywhere near what we had, but maybe it's just getting over the hump, so to speak. I don't know.
It looks different.
It's different. And so let me ask you this: as far as if you have a creative practice, and you're having trouble with it because of the grieving, is there a way to find a way to stay creative and work through that? And what was your advice on that?
I really try to encourage people to, if you are a painter and the paints just aren't speaking to you, and the brushes just aren't, is there a space where you can let that be okay for a moment? And let's maybe have more of a conversation that's creative. And what does grief, how does it enter your everyday experience? And so for some people, that conversation will, turn into, they'll say, it's just this ringing that won't stop. And so we'll move into like kind of a sound area. Or they'll say, it's just, it's just this loud stomping neighbor upstairs. And so then we'll move into like a movement area. I'm kind of metaphorical. That's sort of how I am anyway. And so a lot of times the generative conversations I'm having, people will move into that. And what happens is then they start to realize that maybe it's possible they're not just a visual artist. Maybe there's some movement art in them. Maybe there's some sound art in them. Maybe there's I had one person who said, grief is the onslaught of the words I'm reading on Twitter of like how trash this world is.
I can feel that.
And so I made a suggestion that the next time you go through Twitter, pluck out the words that hit the hardest, write them down, make a list of them. And so then in our next session, what we did was we took those words and we wrote poetry with them. We went through the haiku 575 because it's super easy. 575 is easy. But only using those words. Right. And I didn't know I was a poet. Am I a poet? Am I writing poetry? Yes, you are. Yes,
gotcha.
You are.
So there's sort of, so I'm hearing a little bit that is also being open to maybe other creativity outside of what you
Ye-
identify yourself as. Like if
exactly.
I'm a collage artist, a mixed media artist, which I am, I
Mhm,
may need to be open to poetry
mhm.
to move through my grief,
Yeah.
or open to movement,
Mhm.
or those types of things.
Yeah.
And then also probably working with a therapist, a life coach, somebody,
Yeah,
just
a lot of times when I'm working with people, I'm working concurrent to whatever kind of shape of support they're putting around them. So I'm not the only person. I certainly am not a trauma person. I am not a crisis helpline.
right,
Like I can't be available 24/7.
right,
And definitely when I'm doing intake with people, if I can see that, there's some previous crisis or some previous addiction that came into the grief experience with them, I'm trying to be very clear about that right up front, and to make sure that they have the shape of, an AA sponsor or something concurrent to what we're doing. And it's an interesting thing in the United States to do this kind of work, because sometimes a person has a shape of support around them that allows me to be a concurrent part of a team supporting
okay,
them. And their sponsor will talk with me with permission of the person, of course, or their therapist with a release form. But there's a lot of institutional setup in the United States that their therapist doesn't care if that's what they want. They will not talk to me.
oh,
The social worker was HIPAA. I don't know who I don't care what they sign. I will risk my job if that then becomes part of, and that's part of the continuing education with other helping professionals as well. So then what is the shape of my practice? And I have to be willing, this is for me. I mean, and this, with the other helping professionals, just asking them to hold, question and ask how this
right,
is going to
right,
shape up for
right,
them. But for me, where I've landed is I have to hold things loosely, so
yeah,
that if this feels like a situation where I really need that concurrent communication and it's not going to happen, I have to be able to say, then I can't serve. I'm not the right person.
well, ideally, and I think this is kind of where you're getting at too, to have a circle of support,
Yes.
whether it is a therapist, whether it is a clergy person, whether it is your mama,
Mhm. Yes. Yeah.
just different people around you. And ideally, you have at least one or two of those folks.
Yes. Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what I said. We're living in times that you need a variety of people,
Yes.
really, or interventions to kind of lean on, because
Yes.
this is serious titimes. I mean,
Yes.
heavy.
And I always ask for an emergency contact,
Yeah.
because the last thing I want to do with anyone ever, I will never do, I do not want to call 911 in any situation. Like the situation in this country with the way police get involved with mental health crises.
Mhm.
So that's like one of my hard lines is I need an emergency contact that I absolutely know I can reach if needed.
Yes.
And if you
And
can't do that, then again, that's a space I have to hold lightly and say,
it's interesting, and it's just good to hear what you're saying. Gosh, we need you in every community. Uh,
that's kind of what Kath and I were hoping with the studio. Was like, okay, if we tell these stories enough with other professionals, maybe it will
maybe
like.
maybe we could just sort of spread out. Yeah. Um, all right. This has been such I could go on forever
I
with you,
know, I
Kara.
know.
And maybe not enough time, but hopefully maybe we might have an opportunity to do something or whatever again. Actually, I can see something actually happening here. How can people find out more about you and your work in the studio, and
Mhm,
um, the certification that
mhm.
we're talking about?
Yeah, so
What?
the direct services that I offer, like for people who are themselves grieving, I have workshops and workbooks and things. Those are all at griefandcreativity.com.
Okay.
And you can contact me through there. My email's there and everything. The studio work and the certification program, I do that with a team of people. It's not just me. And we do that through creativegriefstudio.com. And there's so much, like there's just an overwhelming amount of information there. So feel free to dive in. And then if you have questions, of course, there's contact information for Tamra, who is our program administrator for the course, for the certification program.
Wow. Well, thank you, Cara. I've
Yeah,
just,
thank you,
I mean,
Shannon.
like I said, my mind is like, I'm just like kind of souping up, and I'm like, God, I'm looking at the time. I can't keep
Yeah.
doing this, but I hope that I appreciate you being on the podcast, and
Yeah.
look forward to keeping the connection going. And to those of you that are listening or watching, I just want to say that I hope that this podcast gives you a little bit of a glimpse of how important it is to take care of yourself when you're grieving. And we all are experiencing some level of grief, particularly in the last 2.5 years, and that it's okay to own that and to move forward with that, to get support for yourself, as well as open yourself to other ways of creating to help you move forward. Because sometimes what you normally do, what you identify with, is not always going to help you get through. Sometimes you have to go the back way before you go back to what you normally do. And if you have any questions, I will have Cara's information in the show notes. And also, as a creativity coach, I can help you move forward with some of your blocks that might have come because of grief. I had to deal with that myself when my father died about 12 years ago. So, actually, more like 11 years ago. But anyway, so I know what that's about. So, feel free to contact me. And if you have any issues or anything that you want to work on regarding your creativity, please reach out to me. I can be found at sparkyourcreative.com. I'm also on Instagram at Spark Your Creative, and Facebook at Spark Your Creative Coaching, and Twitter at Spark_Create. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts, and also on YouTube. Subscribe and you can get the visual portion of our interviews. We don't have all of the interviews on video, but we do have quite a few. So subscribe and, hit like and comment if you have questions or just want to express yourself. Thank you all for listening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next episode.